If you're like us, you're probably tired of flipping through outdated and expensive regulation books and struggling to understand the rule or guidance you're after. eRigs is the first web and mobile app version of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, helping fleets of all types and sizes better access and understand their regulatory obligations. eRigs is always up to date and allows fleet safety professionals to not only read the rules, but also dig into FMCSA guidance and learn more about complex regulatory topics from industry experts. Highlight, bookmark, and take detailed notes right from the app and access them on any of your devices. And easily share a digital version of the regulations with your drivers so that they too can better understand the rules. eRigs was developed by safety professionals for safety professionals. Try it out for free at erigs.app. All right, hey everyone, welcome to episode 54 of Trucksafe Live, the show where we and our guests tackle the hot button issues impacting highway transportation. I'm Brandon with Trucksafe and Childress Law, both of which are dedicated to helping motor carriers develop and maintain cutting-edge safety programs. Got Tyler, Rob, Brian here with me today. Guys, welcome.
Howdy, howdy.
Good afternoon.
Howdy. At some point, I should probably add you guys to that intro video, since it's been me and Jared on there for a long time. Jared never shows up anymore.
Yeah, I was going to say, who's this Jared guy?
Yeah, we can give him a hard time. Anyway, thanks for everybody for being here. If you're here with us, say hey in the comments so we know who's around. And want to start things off, as always, by thanking the sponsor of this episode, which is Project 61. It aims to improve the life expectancy of CDL drivers by raising awareness, providing resources, and educating drivers on a healthier lifestyle. Learn how you can support the movement over at project-61.org. Thanks to those folks for helping us out. Lots going on in the industry this week, guys, so I wanted to jump on, talk about it all. Obviously, the big news over the last couple of weeks was the USDOT's and FMCSA's announcement that they are withholding a lot of money from the state of California for failing to adequately enforce the ELP mandate. So that's the main topic of today's show. I'm excited to have a special guest with us today to talk about that in a few minutes. Before we get there, though, a few things going on at Trucksafe. As always, our Trucksafe network. If you're not a member of the Trucksafe network, I'd encourage you to join it. It's free to join over at trucksafenetwork.com or scan that QR code and download the app in the App Store or the Google Play Store. This is the space we've built for fleet safety professionals to gather together, learn from one another, ask questions, and access all of our DOT-related content. I've been excited with the app or with the network recently, seeing a lot of participation from other folks in there, asking questions, answering questions, a lot of activity going on in there. So it seems to be a pretty good resource for fleet safety professionals. So, yeah, I'd encourage you to join that if you haven't already. I'll also mention our newsletter. If you're not subscribed to our newsletter, trucksafe.com/subscribe is where you could do that. If you want up-to-date DOT compliance, breaking news, our analysis of regulatory topics, updates on these shows, anything like that, I'd recommend you subscribe to that, and we'll try not to spam you with any spam. So there you go. All right. Some things going on in the industry that are worth talking about. We mentioned this on our last show. The medical certification issue for CDL drivers. This has been going on in the background for several months at this point. Recall that back in June, the rules for how medical cards for CDL drivers are transmitted to their state licensing agencies were supposed to be changing. In other words, we were transitioning to a fully electronic process. For the last 10 years, we've been working with a hybrid process where CDL drivers go and get their med cards from a DOT doctor, and then they have to physically take those med cards to their state licensing agency and get it associated with their driving record. In June, that was supposed to change to an electronic process whereby the medical examiners digitally upload the results of those exams to the National Registry, and then from the National Registry to the state licensing agency. And it was just a debacle. Many states weren't ready for it, despite having 10 years to prepare. Many medical examiners didn't even know about this change for some reason. And so this led to FMCSA having to issue a temporary waiver, which essentially said that, hey, for the time being, we're not going to penalize you, motor carriers or CDL drivers, if you are continuing to follow that old process where you physically take the med card to the state licensing agency and then present it to the motor carrier as proof of your physical qualifications. That was originally supposed to expire this month in October, but no surprise, it got extended again, this time until January 10th of 2026. There are still 12 states that are not ready to accept these electronic transmissions of medical exam results. Does that surprise you guys?
No, and and didn't they, as far as I could remember, didn't they threaten that this was a hard stop? January
for the
12th.
January? If they did, I didn't see that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
That was going to be it. Yeah, well, I'm thinking enough pushback.
Yeah, well, given the topic of today's show, which is FMCSA dropping the hammer on California, it wouldn't surprise me if we started to see some tougher deadlines and stuff like that. But yeah, so that's where we're at. January 10th is now the new expiration date of this waiver, after which time that fully electronic process is supposed to be followed. So anyway, be on the lookout for that. Another thing I'll mention is an update to the English Language Proficiency enforcement. Obviously, this plays big into our topic today, but one of the things we do at Trucksafe is we are monthly basis, we are pulling in the FMCSA's ELP enforcement data and making it a little bit more user-friendly to view by motor carriers and drivers and anybody who's interested in looking at the data. So we just got the data for September. It lags by a few weeks, so wanted to share the latest ELP enforcement data that we're looking at. So this is showing total ELP violations written up in the U.S. That's the blue line that you're seeing on the screen. 2025 year to date, the months at the bottom are cut off, but each of those lines is a month. And then the orange line is total ELP violations where the drivers were placed out of service for the ELP violation over that same time frame. So you could see here that in June, that's when we started to see the numbers tick up, as would be expected, since June 25th was the first date of enhanced enforcement, and then steady incline up through August, which is the 6352 number for the total ELP violations written that month, and then a slight dip in September. But that what we have been seeing is that due to late reporting by some states, with the next monthly update, I would expect that number to go up, and it would probably be somewhere near those last 2 months, July and August. But and then looking at the out of service line there, obviously that's the more important one, showing how many drivers are being sidelined for these ELP violations, as is supposed to be the case now, except in limited circumstances, like at the border, in the border zone, and for some hearing impaired drivers. But yeah, over the last few months here, roughly 5,000, little over 5,000 drivers placed out of service for English language proficiency. Any other thoughts on that, guys? Surprising? Not surprising?
Well, I think what's surprising to me is, or I guess not surprising, is the inability to really do any sort of challenge on these. And have you heard of anybody that has just been put back out on the road and caught for a second time? Have we heard of quote unquote jumping the out of service order from the first one?
Yeah.
Is there civil penalties? Is the company getting looked at? I mean, do we have any of that information yet?
I haven't heard of any of that yet. Rob, have you?
No, we did have an instance where a guy got taken out of the truck and arrested because he overstayed his non-domicile license, work authorization, and right to be here.
Well, we saw a bunch of that in Oklahoma, right? Oklahoma,
Yeah.
And I think maybe a couple other states had stings similar to that.
But in this specific case, he was from Haiti, and they arrested him, and then they let him go later on, and they said that because even though he was expired, even though it was illegal, they couldn't do anything with him because Haiti is in a temporary protective status category. So they let him actually go, get back in the truck and go.
Really? Well, that doesn't make any sense.
No. So there's been a number of those temporary protective status things pop up.
I could see them letting him stay in the country, but not getting back in the truck if he's not
drove it all the way
proficient in
back
English.
to Florida from Texas.
Interesting. Well, I mean, those are the types of stories that we're going to continue to hear, and just have to keep our ears out for how the FMCSA is handling that. Yeah, to your point, Brian, I haven't seen any jumping out of service orders for ELP violations quite yet, but it won't surprise me if we start to see those, particularly the more drivers that get placed out of service. Obviously, the more likelihood of that happening. So, Tyler, anything to add on? You seen anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't seen anything, but how to requalify a driver, right? I think that's the big question is, hey, how do we demonstrate that since they're out of service violation that they can indeed identify signs and speak English?
It's still the $1 million question, right? How do you rehabilitate these drivers if that's a thing? And we're just guessing at this point because we don't have any official recommendations from FMCSA or CVSA or anything like that, as far as I'm aware. And so, the advice we've given to all of our clients is you got to do something. Can't just put them back in the truck. So what is that something you got to do? Probably some kind of pretty extensive English language training, and then having a certificate of completion of that training at your disposal to be able to submit in a data queue challenge if he gets sidelined again. Okay, that's an ELP update. Another thing I saw come through the news channels this past week, Rob, I think you posted about this on FreightWaves or somewhere. A bunch of unions are suing. Let's see here. I've got this up here.
Yeah, it's actually Tyler. Who was it? It was the National Teachers Union or something.
Yeah, National Teachers Union was one of the plaintiffs. There were a couple other drivers associated with some pretty small carriers based on what I saw. But just essentially they filed a petition in the DC circuit to challenge the FMCSA's non-domiciled CDL rulemaking.
Yeah.
On what basis? Do you
know? So, and this may be something that, an attorney who routinely practices in this area of law in terms of petitioning, administrative agency final rules. It was a one-page petition, just said, hey, we petition this rulemaking, period. I mean, it was like a 2-sentence petition. So there's not really any meat to analyze.
Substance to it, yep.
No substance to it. There's some dates. What was it, Rob? November 19th and December 5th that there's various motion practice pleadings. So we'll probably know more about, obviously, what the FMCSA, their basis for the rulemaking and the final rule.
Yeah, well, it's not all that surprising given that this was kind of a shortcut to the rulemaking process. So this was, people may recall, if not, we've got a detailed article on this rulemaking on our website, trucksafe.com, if you're interested. But this was what they call an interim final rule, an IFR, that the FMCSA issued, which essentially bypasses the usual notice and comment period that is usually required to pass an administrative rule. And it pushes that to the back end of things so that the rule goes into effect immediately, and then the agency accepts comments and then maybe or maybe not changes the rule based on those comments after the fact. And so, you can imagine that an agency that decides to go that route is kind of opening itself up for lawsuits because the way that the Administrative Procedures Act works is that very limited situations where that type of emergency rulemaking is warranted, and you have to meet pretty strict standards. And so I have no doubt that those groups will be challenging that as part of their lawsuit, that this was not the appropriate, vehicle for getting this type of rule passed, in addition to, the more substantive claims about FMCSA's authority to do this with regard to non-domiciled CDLs. So just have to wait and see. But yeah, pretty big news. Okay, and then lastly, before we turn to the topic of today, this was another... Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, Brandon, real quick on that. So let's say either the lawsuit's successful or they turn around on this. All the drivers that were put out of a service and arrested and stuff like that, they get their license back, or do they still, they've outstayed their welcome, so to speak, with the CDL. So does that all stand?
It's hard to tell.
Is that a whole separate lawsuit?
Yeah, it's hard to tell what the remedy would be. Since we don't even know what the basis of the lawsuit is, it's hard to forecast what an appropriate remedy would be if they were to prevail in that lawsuit. Plus, there's other issues involved, like, hey, even if the court says that FMCSA didn't have the authority to pull the licenses, there is still a question of whether they're here in the country illegally. And if they're in the country illegally, then regardless of FMCSA's action rulemaking in that regard, I think there's an argument that they shouldn't be able to drive for that reason. So, yeah, it could go 1,000 different ways, probably. But yeah.
Gotcha.
All right. So, lastly, wanted to briefly touch on this news coming out of the Supreme Court of the United States. Big news. A couple weeks ago, they finally granted review on a broker liability case. So I'm going to let Tyler kind of explain what's going on there.
Yeah, so this is huge news for the brokerage industry and brokerage firms. There have been at least 3, I believe 4 prior instances where the Supreme Court has denied a petition to hear review of, essentially, when we say broker liability, it's whether or not brokers can be liable for state law claims like negligence in instances of highway accidents or cargo damage and theft. So it's big news. The court did grant review of a case out of the 7th Circuit, Montgomery versus Caribe. 2, at the same time, or about the same time, there was another case out of the 6th Circuit, Cox versus Total Quality Logistics, that also petitioned for review of pretty much the same issue. It's cast.
Are they getting consolidated in this?
It's really unclear right now. There's not been any news out of the Supreme Court on that. But presumably they might, or they might deny it and just say, hey, we're handling it in the 7th Circuit case. So kind of waiting to hear on that.
How did that 7th Circuit court rule? Where was the 7th Circuit? In favor of preemption?
Plaintiff. Or yeah, in favor of preemption, yeah.
Okay, so in favor of the carrier, or in favor of the broker.
Yeah. So there's a split, which is probably why the Supreme Court took it up. I mean, we've got the 11th and 7th on a previous case that, negligence claims are preempted, and the 6th Circuit and the 9th Circuit are kind of on the other side of that, saying that, they're not preempted. And when I say preempted, it's preempted by the Federal Aviation Administration Authorization Act, specifically 49 U.S. Code 14501, which provides for pretty broad preemption for motor carriers, freight forwarders, and brokers related to routes, prices, services. The key to this is what's called the safety exception. So that's what the Supreme Court's going to be looking at. So obviously, this is just huge in terms of whether or not brokers can be held liable, for negligence related to highway accidents and cargo loss, essentially. So yeah, really, really huge that the Supreme Court has taken this one up.
Yeah, hopefully this will resolve the circuit split, and at least, regardless of which way it goes, at least we'll have some clarity for brokers and possibly even shippers out there about whether they are potentially on the hook for hiring unsafe motor carriers that they then tender the freight to. So we'll see. But yeah, big news. All right. Like I said, a lot going on in the industry, so wanted to touch on that all briefly. Steve on LinkedIn is saying, we had a team that got put out of service at a weigh station in New Mexico. 9 hours later, they got a clean inspection at the same weigh station by a different officer. Well, that's crazy. Anyway. Big news, obviously, this past week was the U.S. DOT's and FMCSA's announcement that those agencies have elected to proceed with withholding over $40 million in federal funding from the state of California for what they claim is the state's failure to adequately enforce the English Language Proficiency rule. Since then, we've had a lot of folks come to us, each individually, asking about federal funding in general and the MCSAP program, what it is, what it entails, how it works, and what this announcement will mean for California. So I'm excited to have with us a special guest today, back on the show for a second or third time, can't remember, Mr. Jack Van Steenburg. Jack, thanks for being here with us.
My honor, Brandon, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, Jack is you're going to have to help me with this, Jack, former Chief Safety Officer and Executive Director for FMCSA, correct?
Yes, correct.
And Assistant Administrator as the Chief Safety Officer, correct?
Correct.
And then before that, you were with the New York State Police, true?
Yep, 25 years with them, and I retired in 2008 from New York State Police. So
this is feeling like a deposition, Brandon.
Yeah, my
Yeah.
gosh.
I got to knock off the leading questions here. Yeah. Shine a bright light in your face, Jack. I just wanted to set up your experience, obviously, and given that you've been on both the federal side and the state side, you've got a pretty good idea of how this MCSAP program functions and some of the political wrangling that goes on between the federal government and the state governments in that regard. So thought you would be the perfect guest to join us today. So thanks for being here. For those who may not be familiar with MCSAP at all, and that may be a lot of folks watching, I was wondering, Jack, if you could just walk us through what it is at its core, and what its purpose is.
Sure, Brandon. And let me just start out by talking about the FMCSA budget. It's a $1 billion budget. $500 million of that budget goes to the MCSAP program, and then about another $100 million goes to various other grant programs at FMCSA. So the MCSAP, Motor Carrier Safety Assistance Program, it's a formula grant that every state gets, and the formula is based on roadway miles within your state, vehicle miles traveled, gasoline consumption, number of registrants, and vehicle miles driven in the state. So it's a formula. So obviously, the bigger states are going to get the bulk of the money. Texas, California, Florida, New York, and so forth are going to get the bulk of the MCSAP money. And the MCSAP program is regulated in the federal regulations. If you look at Part 350, it spells out the criteria that the states must adhere to in the programs that they actually have to do. If you look at 350-203, that's what really lays out the programs that the states are required to do. So I mentioned $500 million that goes to the states. California gets about $31 million each year, and that's without the match.
All right, so here's that regulation you mentioned. So yeah, it's showing, I think what you're talking about now, which is where some of the money goes: driver inspections, vehicle inspections, traffic enforcement, investigations, new entrant safety audits, and a whole list of items.
Yeah, look at the last one.
Other elements that may be prescribed by the administrator, that one?
Yeah. That's your catch-all.
Yeah.
We used to have that with the state police in the best interest of the Division of State Police.
There's always a catch-all.
Yeah, so there's your catch-all there. But so just getting into that, I mentioned $30 million. I think Secretary Duffy took away 40 million.
Yeah.
So there had to be some rollover money involved with this, and in the MCSAP grant program for California. And I know what the secretary did. Basically, it's another regulation in Part 350, and that regulation has to do with compatible laws. And the way I read the letter, and I didn't look at California laws, and it's 350, 303. And in his letter, he mentioned 350, 303, A, B, and C.
Yeah, right
And
here.
there you go. And I don't know if California adopted the English language proficiency laws or they excluded it, but obviously they're not enforcing it. So are they not enforcing it because it's not a law within California? I don't know the specifics, but that's what was in the secretary's letter is A, B, and C, that they didn't comply with A, B, and C.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. I got that here. So this is the letter of nonconformity issued by FMCSA to the state of California. It kind of breaks down what Jack just mentioned here about MCSAP program. Then it says, FMCSA data shows that California is not enforcing the ELP standard during roadside inspections, failing to place drivers out of service. From June 25th, 2025 through August 21st, 2025, FMCSA identified that out of nearly 70,000 inspections conducted by California, 34,000 resulted in at least one violation being issued. Of those 34,000 inspections, only one contained a violation relating to ELP, with that one violation resulting in the driver being placed out of service. Now, I think that's a bit misleading, to be honest, because like I said earlier in the show, one of the things we do is we track the ELP data that FMCSA itself publishes, and anybody can go find this. And you will see that California, over the last few months, has indeed written hundreds of ELP violations. The problem is, however, that as the letter accurately pointed out, only one of those instances was a driver placed out of service for that ELP violation. So the state, it's a little misleading to say the state's not enforcing ELP, but what is clear is they're not placing drivers out of service for ELP. So I think that's the genesis of it.
Well, you saw that in your graph earlier that you did, and I was, you saw the number of violations. I can't remember what it was. I already lost my memory. 6,000, each month or something like that. And then you see the disconnect with out of service. So at some point, hopefully those lines will come together and show that there is out of service with all those violations. So obviously, it's just not California.
Yeah.
But
and a lot of those are border zone ELP violations, so rightfully written up as non-out of service. In Texas, mainly is the one. But yeah, you're right. I mean, that is a big disconnect for sure.
So I looked at some of the history. So all this money's available. It's in the law. It's available to the states. Every year, FMCSA puts out what they call a planning memo for the MCSAP program. Here's what our priorities are, states. You have to do a commercial vehicle safety plan. And basically, the planning memo that FMCSA puts out talks what the priorities are. So I went and looked at 24 and I looked at 25 planning memos, and then I looked at 26. 26 is the only, and 26 planning memo came out July, maybe 2025, kind of right after everything hit the fan on the English language proficiency. But this planning memo, which is now for 26, we're technically in fiscal year 26. So the planning memo did address, there's a whole section on English language proficiency in the planning memo for the states. But in 24 and 25, there was not even mentioned. I mean, there was no highlight in it, no mention. There's a whole paragraph in this year's planning memo. So it wasn't that important to the states. It wasn't that important to the FMCSA at the time, because we had an order at the time through the secretary's office way back when that you're not going to enforce English language proficiency. But
Yeah.
now it's a priority, and I understand. I mean, I remember back then. I mean, I always thought it was a safety impact to the inspector or the law enforcement officer, because you're giving that driver commands, and God forbid that driver doesn't understand it and backs up or runs over somebody. I always thought that safety trumped everything, but that it gets political, and it's something that I just dealt with in my position over the years. But that's it. 26, they put the planning memo out. This is key, and the MCSAP money should have been awarded by now for 26. Obviously, they got the letter that they're withholding, and I think everybody's talking $40 million. So again, California gets about $31 million a year, and then they have to put in a 5% match. And by the way, California, I have friends in the CHP. I've had friends all my career in the CHP. And I remember California they used to tell me, we put so much more money into the program than what the federal government gives us. And if I looked at California's commercial vehicle safety plan, they have almost 1,000 personnel dedicated to commercial vehicles. And I'm not saying it's all on the road, but obviously there's got to be administrative people, data analysts, you got borders in California, but 1,000 personnel assigned to them.
Yeah, is that the biggest group or biggest state in terms of commercial vehicle enforcement, as far as you know?
California and Texas always ran side by side. And I remember crashes. Texas is number one in crashes, unfortunately. California is number two. So, but I can't remember if California is one or Texas is one. So.
And so did I hear you correctly that 40.6 million is virtually the entire amount that FMCSA would normally allocate to California?
No, California gets about 31 million a year. And I look back in fiscal year 18, they got 18.4, fiscal year 24, 30.5, and there was gradual increases, but not that much. So I'm assuming in fiscal 26, it's got to be around 31 million, 31.5 million that they're getting.
So what would the 40.6 million, would that be? That's
it could
over
be rollover, Brandon.
Rollover
So you don't spend the money in 1 year, you get an opportunity to roll over another. You get a year to accept it, and then you get a year or two to spend it. So there's always rollover money.
I gotcha.
So I'm assuming there's some rollover money in that, especially if we're just strictly talking MCSAP funding.
Yeah.
Because there are other grant programs, but that letter just talked about MCSAP funding.
Sure. Go ahead, Brian. I cut you off.
Yeah, I'm going to assume, Jack, like with the state of California, the money that they're putting in, they have to support that BIT program themselves. That the MCSAP funding doesn't go to that, correct?
Correct. And I looked at what California spends the money on. A lot of it's overtime, a lot of it's equipment, a lot of it's computer, the computers for their MCSAP people, IT needs and so forth like that. And I'm not saying some of the MCSAP money doesn't go to personnel. I'm sure it does, but California, I mean, I just imagine how much it costs between 1,000 people doing commercial vehicle funding, and then you got you tie in the indirect costs with benefits and so forth like that. They far exceed the required match. So, but what I'm getting at was California always said, "Hey, we have such a big program, we really don't need MCSAP." And that was years ago with any discussion and never not accepting it either. So.
Hey, Jack, one thing you mentioned that I wanted to kind of double click on. I hate when people say that. I don't know why I just said that, but to dig deeper on is compatibility. And I know it's baked into the regulation, but it's a topic that our motor carrier clients sometimes come to us with, and I always have to go back and reread the MCSAP regulations. But the regulations, if I recall correctly, do have quite a bit to say about areas where the states are entitled to deviate from the federal requirements. And I think it's split off between interstate and intrastate regulations. So I think a lot of folks get confused. They think, hey, if this is just a truly intrastate commerce, the states have free reign to do whatever they want with their state regulations. But that's not the case, because under these compatibility regulations, if I've got this correct, if they're receiving MCSAP funding, they have to agree even for their intrastate regulations to adopt compatible regulations for the intrastate operations as well. Is that true?
Yes, they have to. And there's always an exception. They could always request an exception for something. But yes, and they have 3 years, Brandon, to adapt those regulations. Like I know in New York, it used to be 3 years. They always went to the wire,
California does that quite a bit too.
Yeah.
One of the issues we're dealing with one of our clients, Tyler and I have been dealing with it, is there's a regulation under the federal regs about the placement of camera devices in the windshield of commercial vehicles, like how far down it can be from the top of the windshield. And FMCSA changed their regulation a few years back to give a bigger area on the window that the device could be placed. And California has not changed their state regulation to mirror that requirement. And so it's still a smaller area on the window. And so California is continuing to cite our motor carrier clients for having devices in a place that meets the federal regs but doesn't meet their state regs. And so that's one area that's typical of the situation that we're dealing with when we're looking at these compatibility regulations, is stuff like that. Yeah.
And to me, there's the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And I mean, if we're getting that picky, some of these, right, there's over 900 regulations on a book. I mean, I think you could cut half of them out without, hurting anybody.
Anybody noticing? Yeah, probably so.
So, Jack, my question is, how does California get this money back? It's being withheld. What do they do other than?
Well, I'm assuming they're going to hold it. I mean, they have. So right now, we're in fiscal year 26. I believe FMCSA has another year. They can wait an extra year into 27 to give that money back. So they're not giving it away right now. And, I'm sure there's some negotiations going around, and I don't know. I mean, it's certainly political. And, Brandon, you asked me the other day, do I see other states getting into this? I just, the state of this country that we're in right now, with being so decisive or indecisive and split, it bugs me. I just wish we can come together and, work together and find some type of collaboration and consensus. So I think there's going to be other states down the road. And, I have to agree with Secretary Duffy. I mean, he stood his ground, and I truly believe English language proficiency is a safety issue that has to be addressed.
So, agreed. That's the DOT's position. That's been made plain to California. I did want to briefly look at California's response to all of this. No surprise, California has refuted FMCSA's ELP enforcement claim. This is an article just reading from here. California Governor Gavin Newsom responded, "Facts don't lie, but the Trump administration sure does. California does require ELP and tests for it as a condition of receiving a CDL, as you can read for yourself." And then they submitted a 25-page letter to FMCSA explaining their position, which I did everybody the favor of reading so you don't have to. It essentially boils down to them arguing that FMCSA doesn't, in its regulations, require ELP testing roadside. California's claim is that it only mandates that drivers be proficient, and it doesn't tell law enforcement where they have to check proficiency. And so their claim is, hey, we do that when we are issuing CDLs to CDL drivers. We issue the test in English, although I think they also issue it in Spanish, if I remember correctly. But supposedly they don't allow CDL drivers to get a CDL if they're not proficient in English, and they claim that meets the intent of the regulation and the plain language of the regulation. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that, Jack. I think the obvious one that comes to my mind that just sticks out like a sore thumb is the ELP rule applies not just to CDL drivers. It applies to any regulated drivers, including non-CDL drivers. So if you're saying you accomplish this through your CDL program. Well, my response is, what about for non-CDL drivers? What are you doing for them? And they didn't address that at all in their regulation. So that was my quick thought. But thoughts on that, Jack, their response?
No, and I've been saying that right along. You've seen some of my comments that we're always dismissing that 10,001 driver up to the 26,000. So you're right, Brandon. And then, in a way, the guidance is not part of the regulations. It's just what it is guidance, that testing, that memo that went out, and here's the testing, here's what you test roadside for. So it's not it's not a regulation, it's not a law. To me, it's an assist of, how to enforce that regulation. So, and I hear where the states, are coming from it in that respect. So, I don't know where it's going to go, Brandon, but
it'll be interesting because if you look at just the compatibility regulation that we were looking at earlier, it says a state must conduct a review of its laws, regulations, standards, and orders to make sure that they're compatible. So it seems to be pretty clear that, hey, if you want this money, because that's really what we're after. We're not telling California, it's not like the FMCSA is suing California for not enforcing the law. They're saying, you volunteered to be part of this federal funding program that we offer, and as a condition to participating in this federal funding, you've agreed to certain things, one of which was to make sure your standards and orders are compatible with ours, and FMCSA is saying that they're not. So I see, like you, Jack, I see both sides of the argument, although I tend to fall on FMCSA's side here when it comes to that argument in particular.
So one of the big issues too, Brandon, is, and I'm hoping it doesn't go this far, is the unintended consequences. Now, California could come up and say, hey, you cut our MCSAP funds, we're not going to put data into your system through the MCMIS system. And, I looked at the data that they do 445,000 inspections a year. And out of 2.8 million. So they do quite a bit of the inspections nationwide. They do a lot of safety audits. They do some investigations or compliance reviews. But those inspections, if they don't submit them, that's going to impact the CSA program, the SMS, and you're going to have skewed data with nothing in from California. I hope they don't go that far. I know Oregon several years ago, they didn't take MCSAP money for whatever reason, but they still continued to submit data through the MCSAP program, through the roadside inspections program.
Yeah, that would really screw them over with CSA, right? Because how could you reliably compare carriers if a state in which a lot of carriers are domiciled isn't reported? I mean, it would completely break the CSA system, I think.
It would. It wouldn't. I'm hoping it doesn't go. And then, and I remember when I was around, we were always talking about withholding funding. You're putting funding in for safety, but now you're withholding it. So now you're not doing anything. But I think California still, they're going to continue to do roadside inspections and so forth. They got the personnel, and they're not going to compromise safety roadside.
But I think that was my question.
Oh yeah, Rob, go ahead. I think we're on the same page on this.
Yeah, my question on this was kind of like from a finance mindset of, obviously, if you reduce your budget $30.1 million, $30.7 million, either you're going to have to reduce your increase your revenue or reduce your workflow, right? So if you're doing 453,000 inspections a year, which I think is what they did last year, that 80% of that activity is funded by MCSAP funds. So if you're taking an 80% hit just to that part of your business, you have to resolve that financially somewhere, right? So are you going to pull money from your $3 billion CHP budget and reduce other programs, because you have to pay for it some way, right? So are you going to reduce your activity and your workload by not performing as many inspections, or are you going to pull money from the other $3 billion in your CHP budget, which is going to reduce other safety or law enforcement programs? Well, one way or the other, you've got to rectify that loss, right? So I don't know what your thought is on that, but.
So Rob, about 3 years ago, they officially changed the match. You don't need, it used to be 15% across the board. at the discretion now of the administrator, you can lower the match. And California is a 5% match, where most of the states are 5% match now. But in saying that, the 30.5 million that California is supposed to get in 26 or something like that, and the 40 million they withheld, when I looked at their budget and looked at their plan, most of that money was for equipment. It was for overtime. It was for computers. So obviously they're not going to get that. So they're going to have to take that from somewhere else in their budget if they want to, keep going and so forth like that. Yeah, you lose $40 million, you're going to make it up if they want to keep up to that same level of effort. And then within the MCSAP program, they have what they call the maintenance of effort, which is that you will pledge that you'll maintain your effort, and the maintenance effort goes back like 6, 7, 8 years ago, where you got to have, and I think the years maybe are 18, 19, and 20, where you have to maintain that level that you did back in those 3 years. So California is not going to have any problem with that maintenance of effort anyway. But if they want to keep up the same exact program with the same exact equipment and same functions, they're going to have to make up for that $40 million that was taken, withheld from them.
Yeah, that was my big focus on it, because I know when we had terminals, especially on the passenger side in California and Monterey and Sonoma and San Diego, you still have terminal inspections for passenger carriers and bit inspections and things like that. So that was my concern, is like, are you going to start letting coach bus operations or regular passenger operations fall apart and not stop servicing PUC because you don't have enough money to do it? So that's been my thought on it.
I think they do what, two bit inspections a year for each trucking company there.
Yeah.
I think that used to be true. Is it just for bus companies now, Rob? I think for property carriers, I think they moved to a CSA like intervention prioritization system, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, for the most part, you have to earn a bit inspection.
Yeah,
on the trucking side.
Got it.
Yeah,
and then California also notoriously has their 90-day vehicle inspection requirement, which is more stringent than the federal annual inspection requirement. That kind of also plays into that compatibility review. That's something I've always thought was because what I've seen. So this is getting in the weeds, but if you go to that compatibility regulation, if we're talking interstate drivers and fleets, the state is only entitled to impose more stringent regulations if the Secretary of Transportation determines that more stringent regulation will have a safety benefit and won't impede interstate commerce, essentially. And I've always taken the position that California's imposition of that 90-day vehicle inspection requirement, to the extent they're applying it to interstate regulated vehicles, runs afoul of these compatibility regulations. They could do it for intrastate commerce, but for interstate, I think it's a problem for them. California has several areas where they do that, more so than really any other state I've seen in the country. So I think they've got several MCSAP concerns that I've seen over the years. It's kind of an aside. It's just me venting. Okay, a couple questions here on LinkedIn. So Alex is saying, if states are losing funding over English rules, but there's no clear federal test defining proficiency, how are fleets supposed to consistently enforce something that's subjective? Yeah, as we said at the start, that's the $1 million question, right? Is, what are fleets to do about this if it's such a subjective standard? And I think FMCSA has done all that it's going to do. It has issued an enforcement policy that lays out the 2-part test and gives some instruction to law enforcement on how they see them enforcing it. And that's what they've done to address the subjectivity, but it still leaves a lot of open questions. I haven't heard any talk of them clarifying any of those questions. Have you, Jack?
I haven't, but I go back to, I remember looking at the video, and I think it was New Mexico at the time.
Yeah.
A lot of this got highlighted. And I started thinking New Mexico, Texas, a lot of people down there, a lot of the officers are bilingual.
Yeah, right.
And bilingual, you're going to understand someone a lot more than I am, because
yeah.
So
right.
Again, it comes out to being subjective.
Yeah, because they get the pass.
Bilingual.
Yeah, they get the pass by that bilingual officer, and then they continue on into Florida or wherever they're going, and that next officer's not bilingual, well, it's just going to be the truth that they see it differently based on their backgrounds and what they understand. So yeah, it makes it tough for carriers and drivers. Michael on LinkedIn is raising a point that I've seen others raise in the past, and it's one that's probably too far in the weeds for this conversation, but I think it is a legitimate issue, a question that kind of weighs in favor of California's point on this. I don't think California articulated this in their letter response to FMCSA, but if I were their lawyer, I would have told them to raise this as well, which is, and I don't know if you've looked into this or not, Jack, but if you look up where in the federal safety regulations the FMCSA has adopted the CVSA's out of service criteria, you will only find it explicitly mentioned in one place in the regulations, and that's in Part 385. And if you read that regulation, it only adopts the out of service criteria as applied to transportation of highway route controlled quantities of radioactive materials. And so it doesn't specifically, explicitly adopt CVSA's out of service criteria for anything else other than highway route control quantities of radioactive material, hazmat, essentially.
Yeah, and I think maybe you and I have talked about this, but that's the level 6 inspection.
Yeah, right.
It is referenced, I believe, in 390.5.
If you look at the definition, of out, this has always been my counter to that. If you look at the definition of out of service order in section 390.5, it implicitly adopts the out of service criteria in that definition because it defines out of service order as the CVSA's, North American standard out of service criteria. So I think that would be FMCSA's counter to it, but I think it's a good point, and it's something I don't know why FMCSA hasn't just done explicitly in its regulations, which is just adopt the out of service criteria. But
I agree. I thought it might have been in the interim final rule that they would put it in there.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe they would do it to make it clear.
Still not.
And talking to the CVSA folks, the leadership there, they wanted to see it made clear and explicit in the federal regulations.
Yeah, that's been a gap for, decades at this point.
It has.
In any event. All right, guys, what else am I missing? Tyler, Rob, Brian, any other questions for Jack?
The other one that I had was I wrote an article on this in June. This was kind of like when this all kicked off. Texas had a law, 522.043, and it specifically has a law. Like the governor can't repeal the law, right? The governor down there can say anything he wants in terms of we will enforce ELP. But their transportation code 522.043 says you cannot ask intrastate drivers to verify that they can speak English. That's what the law says. So my question had always been, well, if we're going to hit California, Texas actually has a state law that says we are not enforcing this. Our state law is actually contrary to it. So even though they're saying they're enforcing it, the law says something different. So I guess the way I looked at it was, how do we hit California, but we don't hit other states like Texas when you actually have a law on the books that says we're not going to ask?
I think the difference, Rob, you and I may have talked about this briefly.
Yeah.
But I think the difference I see is that law that you're referencing isn't in their motor carrier safety regulations. I think if I remember correctly, I think it's in their DMV regulations, and I think it is essentially prohibiting the DMV from testing English proficiency as a condition to getting a driver's license in the state. I don't think, if I'm recalling correctly, that it prohibits law enforcement from enforcing English language proficiency roadside. I think that may be the difference. Yeah.
I think there's an easier answer.
What's the easier answer?
We have a blue state and we've got a red state.
You think
I
that's
think
the
that's
answer?
the easier answer.
That's probably right.
I wasn't going to go there, but
No.
Rob has more faith.
Maybe
Rob has more faith in the government than Tyler does.
Jack, I heard that, and somehow with the MCSAP funding, that this was another claim that I think I may have heard from an inspector, that the voluntary inspections, that they don't get paid for those through any sort of funding. It's almost like they're doing them on goodwill. Is there any truth to that? Or
I was always against voluntary inspections. Like, I'm going to set up an inspection for trucks all one day to come in because you're going to get the best. It's not a
Right.
true reflection of what so I didn't like that. I always when I started looking at some of the data, I always just looked at the time, how long it takes to do a level 1 inspection. And trust me, we looked at them. I saw some that were under 10 minutes, and you flag those things. But I didn't really like the voluntary inspections because I don't think it was fair and a true reflection on that motor carrier's operation or that truck's operation.
Yeah.
Do you think they'll start tacking the threat of we're going to pull your funding to different pieces of either legislation or rulings that are coming down if this is quote unquote successful?
I don't know what they're going to do legislation. I can't figure out, the Senate and the House on either side. So I don't know what they're going to do, but, I have to give Secretary Duffy support. He did it, and we'll see where it goes to other states, Brian. And, if there's other states that are, and I'm assuming, if he does it for one state and they're just as bad as California, or he's claiming California is, they probably should do it for another state, but I don't know the details.
One question I did have, this just came to me. I've thought about it in the past, but it's slightly unrelated, but it has to do with, so obviously FMCSA through the MCSAP program has a hammer it can drop on the states, obviously, as we're seeing here, when the state law enforcement is not enforcing regulations or has different regulations, that type of stuff. But what about the issue of like non-domiciled CDLs and also the medical certification integration rule that we talked about at the start of the show, where it's the state licensing agencies that are being required to do something and they're failing to do it? What does FMCSA have any hammers it can drop on state licensing agencies, and what would be the mechanism for doing that?
I mean, the only hammer that I can see without thinking through it is the high priority grant, and where all this money, and then there's technology grants that is made available for the state licensing agencies to fund some of these programs.
Yeah.
However, in saying that, the MCSAP program, they can have, each state has a lead agency.
Yeah.
The MCSAP program can bring in, and I'll just use New York. We work together with the New York State Department of Motor Vehicles. The State Department of Transportation is the lead agency. State Police was a grant recipient. DMV was a grant recipient.
Okay.
So some of these funds going to a MCSAP agency may be going to the state licensing agencies anyway. But, so that's one means. But the high priority grants that go to the states, a lot of them are they set up for the licensing agencies, so they could withhold funds that way too, or just not grant or give them those grant fundings.
Yeah, that makes sense. Last question from me, and then we're about out of time. So another announcement that came through in the last couple of weeks, Derek Bars was finally confirmed by the U.S. Senate as the next administrator of FMCSA after several months of waiting. And so, that was kind of exciting news. But my question to you is, how much do you envy him now that all this stuff he's stepping right into the middle of all these political debates?
Well, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, but that's me. I mean, Derek is a person that I know that can work with all avenues of the motor carrier industry, and he's proven that. And I think if anybody can get this done, if anybody can get the states to come together with the federal government to enforce the laws or adapt the laws, I think it's Derek. He's got to get his team in place, and over time he will. And I just hope he, because he came in, 9 months into the administration. So he lost 9 months, but the guy knows FMCSA, so he's not going to have, and he knows the programs. So it's not going to take that much time for him to get caught up. So, I think he's the person to get the job done, especially with the support of the secretary.
Yeah. Well, somebody on YouTube said they had a question, but I haven't seen the question come through. So, and we are out of time. So, anyway, I wanted to thank you again, Jack, as always, for being with us, taking some time out of your day to be here. Really appreciate your insight on all of these topics. So, where can folks find you if they need some help with whatever they got going on from a compliance perspective? I know you help fleets with that currently.
Yeah, I'm doing my own CMV Safety Experts LLC. My email is jackvs1@outlook.com. jackvs1@outlook.com. If they want some help in a matter, give me a call and or send me an email, and I'll be glad to talk to them.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jack. Really appreciate it. All right, guys, wrapping things up here. If anybody wants to catch our prior episodes or anything like that, you can either subscribe to the podcast wherever you happen to get your podcast or check them out over at trucksafelive.com. Stay tuned for information on our next episode, submit show ideas, read guest bios, all of that over at trucksafelive.com. Appreciate you all being here today. Tyler, Rob, Brian, thanks for being here. Anything else before we close it out?
No.
We got
all right. See you guys. Thanks.